Yeah, Dave asked me if I'd come on and I would do one of these paddle chats, and because it's been a bit of a weird year, hasn't it? Of course, as we've all experienced, and I sort of thought, well, you know, what am I going to chat about? What could I bring and what could I do? And after a sort of few discussions back and forth with Dave, I kind of settled on the idea that it would be useful probably for people to chat, or for me to chat to people about leadership and the challenges, and also the pitfalls and things that you might be wanting to potentially avoid. So what I've got here, I hope is going to be useful and is going to be interesting. But I'm really happy to go off a bit of a tangent if people have got different questions or different thoughts as well. And there's quite a bit of audience participation here. Hopefully, that's what I'm aiming for. So there's definitely some moments where we'll do some questions, and also some points where it might just be handy for you to drop something into the chat as well. Or if you want to stop me in my tracks and say, Chris, can I chat about that? Then by all means, we can do that. So I've got a screen to share with you and a bit of a presentation there. So yeah, that's my kind of working title: leadership and the challenges you face and the pitfalls to avoid. So just a little bit about me. That's me on the right hand side there. And I think this photo was taken in 1999. I think I'm paddling probably a couple of years at that point, so quite an old one. I've grown up just a tiny bit more than that, but either way, I've been paddling for over 20 years now. I say 20 years quite a lot, but I've been saying that for a few years, so it must be 22 or 23 by now. Still paddle with the guy on the left. That's Gav Barker, part of the British freestyle team, if you know him. Like my original background was getting on the water with my local canoe club. I learned at an activity centre, and the activity centre was connected to, the canoe club was connected to the activity centre that was based there. And what they were really getting into with the canoe club was freestyle, or playboating, or rodeo as we would have called it back then. So my background initially is all in white water, and quite specifically in trying to do new spins and tricks and all that sort of thing as well. As my paddling's progressed, I've definitely moved more into just doing general white water and white water trips as well. And I'm really fortunate to have the opportunities and also the skills to go and do some quite exciting white water. Although I suppose exciting is very relative. You know, you can have excitement on grade 1. I have excitement on slightly higher grades, but I still can find grade 1 exciting. But yeah, I go and do a bit of that sort of stuff and a bit of this sort of stuff. Bear in mind, this isn't every day, by the way. So, you know, like when you're doing one of these presentations, I'm sure some of you will have done before, you always pick your best photos, don't you? So don't get the impression that that's like happened yesterday and it's also happening tomorrow. These are just some of the kind of best ones. So I quite like a bit of white water. I like a bit of waterfalls, but a large amount of what I do on the water as well is also teaching and coaching and instructing. I'm running coach training and also training of the trainers as well. So I do some work directly for British Canoeing to actually train the trainers as well. So here's me saying to somebody, this is a throwback. That's what the caption should be there, shouldn't it? I also like some other aspects of paddle sport as well. So certainly in the last 5 years or so, I've taken up stand-up paddleboarding pretty much as my second discipline to white water. I've kind of shelved the canoe a little bit for the time being, and end up going out on a board on my feet, standing up and paddling around. This is a photo from a trip that I did out in Malta a few years ago, which I'll come back to. But I'd say my two main things really are white water and stand-up paddleboarding. But behind all of this as well, there's also quite a long background of working generally in the outdoors and leading groups as well. So whilst paddle sports is my main focus, I also have spent quite a lot of time leading people in the mountains, leading activities like rock climbing and bushcraft and that sort of thing as well. Whilst I wouldn't see those as being my true area of expertise, it's still something that I've got background in doing as well. So hopefully, what I'm trying to say here is I can credibly say to you that I've done some leadership and it's been successful, and it's also had times where it's not been as successful. And I suppose the presentation tonight is probably focused a little bit more around the moments that maybe aren't as successful and how I've learned from them. So when I was getting started with leadership, I was really after like something to hang my hat on, something to be able to use as a tool or as a way of working out what I should or maybe shouldn't be doing. So I came across a few different things, and I really like this picture here, because I think it really explains a little bit about what I'm after when I'm out there in my own personal paddle and my own personal adventurous experiences. I quite like it when the outcome isn't fixed. We don't quite know what it's going to be, and there's also the potential for mild peril. I don't want to say danger. I don't mean that I want it to be dangerous, but a bit of excitement through the challenge and the unpredicted sort of adventure there as well. So I was looking for some different models, and I came across this one, which I'm sure people will have seen before. And initially I started to use this quite a bit, thinking about, if I'm leading somebody, how much challenge do I give them and how much support do I give them? And this was like a model that I still think is useful, but it really managed to frame it for me really well, and was just something that I could really get started with. So looking at the idea that if there's a low level of challenge and a low level of support, there's probably going to be people who aren't that interested. But if there's a high level of challenge and also a low level of support, there's going to be like real problems, and it says there retreat. So where we're looking for maybe is high challenge, high support, looking at maximum growth. But one of the problems I've found with this is that people don't really fit that well all the time into these kind of boxes. We're working with people, and you can't always put people on a graph. So it's really difficult to make this, I think, work really tangibly in the sort of real environment of going out on the water and taking people into the hills, whatever. And I came across this as well, which I thought fitted quite well alongside that, looking at the sort of level of risk and competence and where our peak adventure is and where misadventure and disaster might lie. But those couple of things just got me started and got me thinking about, how do I actually lead people successfully in the outdoors? Have people seen those before, by the way? Maybe just give me a thumbs up if you've seen some of those before. Yeah, okay, some people have seen those before. That's great. So I came across this statement. I think it was just on a website, and it was about like taking people into the wilderness and doing adventurous activities with them. It's the idea that leadership in the outdoors isn't rocket science; it's more complicated than rocket science. And I think that has rang true over the years, that it's very much about people, or for me it is very much about people and the interactions that people have with the other people that are there, and also with the environment as well. And that leads to a lot of potential complications. It leads to actually being a real challenge to work out what should you do for yourself and others to allow people to have a really enjoyable experience in the outdoors. And I started looking into that a little bit deeper, and I came across sort of two pretty different methods of leadership. One is a sort of scientific approach, and one is a more dynamic approach. And I thought about the most dynamic team I could think of, and that, of course, is the A-team. So in terms of leadership, then, it's pretty difficult to go with a scientific formula of, if you do this and you do that, you will definitely get this outcome. So it's not the same as saying, if you add A to B, you will definitely get C. And if you're into science or maths, I'm sure that doesn't actually make sense, but hopefully you get the message I'm trying to say there. So that idea of using a really formulaic approach just didn't seem to really work. It was like, I can't say if I always do this, then I'll always get the same outcome, because people and the environment are so dynamic and so fluid that it really changes quite a bit. So I started thinking about how to be more dynamic with my leadership, how to be more responsive to the situation, more responsive to the environment, to think about the signs that are being presented to me as well. And to just put that into context with the A-team, if you've ever seen an episode of the A-team, which I'm sure people must have done, I don't know how you could get to where you are in life now without having seen at least one episode of the A-team. They're the kind of team that when something happens, they just respond to it. And they don't respond to it by saying, oh, I don't know what we should do. They respond to it with a creative idea or another approach. and ultimately they actually work together as a team as well. So there's some real characters that are individuals, but they're actually working together for that common goal. So thinking about the strengths that team bring to that experience is something that I also try and think about quite a bit. So hopefully get the two different approaches there. We can't just say, if we do this and we add this formula, we'll get this tangible result. And at the same time, if we only ever try and do like completely dynamic and improvisational leadership, how will we ever make a plan for what we might do? Yeah. So maybe a little blend of both is useful, but I think more recently, certainly as I've really got thinking about this, I've tried to go along the lines of, let's be a little bit more like the A-team and a bit less like the scientist. So here's a question for you then. As I said, I'd throw out a few questions to you to try and get everybody engaged. Does your leadership have a direct relationship to your personal skill level? Yeah. So if you're out there in the outdoors, on the water, or you might be in a different field, because you're probably a participant there as well, you're actually active in the environment. So does your leadership have a direct relationship to your personal skill level? Anybody got any thoughts on that? Feel free to just give us a wave and to come on if you want. Oh, Sam's giving us a wave, or being waved on his behalf. You could just answer and say no, and then mute yourself if you want.
I was just trying to work out how to unmute myself. I think it definitely does in most, I'd say it definitely does in most situations. So I would find myself probably becoming a bit more coach-led and sort of almost authoritarian if I was finding the situation less comfortable myself. So if I wasn't completely comfortable in that situation, I'm going to be a lot more authoritarian with the group I'm leading. Whereas if I'm completely chilled with where we are and what we're doing, I'm going to be a lot more letting them take the lead a lot more.
Yeah, it's interesting because I've certainly thought about this quite a lot. You know, is it possible to be a leader in an environment where maybe you're challenged or maybe you're not as confident and comfortable? But we have the participation element, don't we? We've got that moment of, well, if I've still got to paddle myself or get from A to B and I can't do that, then how could I be leading? Does anybody else have any other thoughts on that? Anybody think differently by any chance? Think that you could potentially be a leader but still need support maybe in that environment?
Don't just put your hand up, Harry, talk.
I'd say that I'm quite lucky that I've led in a sailing background as well as in the paddle sport. In the sailing background, I've found that I've been quite lucky to work with some quite high level performers, and that's led me to been leading them where I've not necessarily been, my personal skill has not been at the same level as theirs, in an environment where I'm at the top end of my personal ability, but because of the group's ability, it's allowed me to kind of lead the group in such a way that I would set a task, they'd go off and do a task, I'd still keep an eye on what's going on, but it's still allowed me to kind of interact with the group while still being kind of at the top end of the level that I was sailing at. Yeah,
and I think that's really interesting because we've got to consider the roles that the leader might be playing in those sort of situations. If the group are competent to perform safety duties, whatever those might look like in different environments, if they're competent to rescue or to roll or to get back in their boats or to maybe not go in the water in the first place, does that mean that the group can share the responsibility of the safety, meaning that the leadership is potential of also being shared, but maybe can be resting on somebody's shoulders who also might be challenged in that environment? I'm going to move you on to the next slide to kind of do a follow-up question here. So we've got a picture of two sea kayakers there. And I think it'd be really easy to assume in this moment that the person who is in charge or the leader is the person in the green boat in the background, and the person who's being looked after is the person who's in the foreground in the water. But I suppose the question is, could it be the other way around? Is it possible that somebody could still be leading, but still need support for a rescue? Mark, Jan and Vicky, you're nodding your head.
Yeah, Chris.
Yeah, right. Yeah, I think it is. I experienced myself that I was the one who always capsized and everybody has to help me, but I was still in charge of the group, as in group control and everything. But being not able to have the right boat under my bum, I was the one who always capsized.
Yeah.
That was actually in Anglesey.
It's an interesting thing. It's an interesting thing, this, actually, because I think that typically, and this is just me speaking from my own experience, it would be the norm that the leader would be competent in the environment, would be experienced, and probably would require less safety support than some of the people that are being led. Yeah. But it's only a matter of time when we're leading before we end up in the water ourselves. And I was leading a few years ago out in Germany, and went through a gorge section out there, and I was the last one through, and I'd not actually seen the rapid. I was working with somebody else who was out there, and they'd been through the rapid loads of times, but I hadn't been through before. And so I was the last one to come through, and the message I got was, you can go anywhere on this small drop. It was only about half a metre high. You can go anywhere on this ledge, and then just follow down through the gorge. So I thought, this is fine, looks fine, no problem. You know, the information I got was, it's dead easy, or that's at least what I'd heard. So I set off towards this really simple move, lined up for my booth, and as I lined up for my booth and I looked over the lip of the drop, and it was only about half a metre, really small. As I lined up over it, there was a rock, like, just hidden under the water. And I got sucked onto it, and instantly I was pinned to the point of where I thought, you're not getting out of this at all. You know, I was genuinely really, really stuck. And it must have only been seconds, but I thought, you're not coming free of this, get yourself out your boat. So of course I bailed out, wriggled out of my boat, managed to have no issues with kind of getting out of my boat and around the rock. And of course I'm swimming down through the gorge. Now in that moment, I'm meant to be the leader, or at least the co-leader. You know, I'm meant to be working with somebody else, and now I need my students or the people I'm leading to look after me. So after that experience, I really started thinking, well, if safety isn't really the main reason for the leadership, then is it possible to be able to be leading in an environment where you're still challenged and still might end up in the water? I'm going to move us on in a second, but does that sort of story sit true for anybody? Does anybody sort of think, you know what, that's happened to me in a different context maybe? I've ended up in the water and needed a bit of help myself. Even though it's silent, I know deep down inside, I'm sure it has. So, moving us on a little bit, I've been thinking quite a bit recently about what keeps us safe. When I was chatting to Dave about this presentation and putting this together, one of the things this was like my working title, you know, what keeps us safe? And I'd like to throw this back out to you again. You know, what are the key things that keep us safe? If that's one of our leadership roles potentially, what is keeping us safe? Is it skills that we have? Is it equipment that we have? Is it experience? Is it the decisions that we make? You know, what's keeping us safe? Or of course, it could be a combination. Who's going to talk to me? Steve, you're unmuted.
Muted, yeah. Hi, Chris. I think it is a combination, but the key is how we start off and how we prep for our day. And you know, we're looking at the environment. So what environment are we going into, and who are we going into the environment with?
Yeah.
And it is our key role, the safety, or is part of our participants' day to look after and develop their safety and understanding of their journey. And perhaps, you know, we're there to support their decision making and enhance their experience and develop the skills along the way. So yeah, I think it's a massive thing to talk about, but just touching very, very briefly, I think all those things come into play, but it starts with that planning, the conversations we all have with clients or our friends. You know, it's the same when we go on a journey with our friends. We have those conversations beforehand, and we set out our day, and the expectancy plays a big role as well. And I think sometimes the clarity of that expectancy doesn't come through, particularly within club environments where lots of different people might maybe turning up and, you know, well, this is what I want from the day, but we sometimes fail to get that across, and there's no understanding. So yeah, there's a lot going on there, really.
Yeah, and I recognise that it's not an exhaustive list that's there. You know, it's more than just skills, equipment, experience, and decisions. But what you said there really, really identifies some of one of the things I'm going to chat about later, which is about, you know, effective planning. How do we attempt to do that? And I think the planning part is really important. And of course, the planning influences your decision making as you go. And I love the fact you just said about empowering the people that you're working with, whether that's in the club or people that you're leading, to help them make safe decisions as well. Because at some point, you're not going to be there to look after them if that's your role, and they're going to have to make decisions themselves, aren't they? So teaching that decision making, I actually think, is a really important part of my leadership. Anyway, anybody else got any other thoughts at all?
Hi, Chris. Dave's just been called out with mountain rescue, so I'm afraid you're left with me. But we've had a couple of messages in the group chat about the people just agreeing that Dell said it's all of them, and Katrina said it's a combination of all of those things. So there's been a few people don't want to speak in person, but they're putting some bits in the chat.
Great stuff, thank you. And I've just realised that I can pop the chat out while I'm doing the screen share as well, so I can see those now too. So thank you for that. I'll tell you where this question comes from, because as I said, about 5 years ago, I started stand-up paddleboarding. And so my knowledge on paddleboarding at that point was pretty limited. I thought I got really good knowledge on the water, you know, really good experience of being on the water, really good experience of white water and open water as well. And I'd fundamentally got a real good handle on the kit and equipment that we might use as well. But a lot of what I was doing was essentially just working it out a little bit as I go, and chatting to people and getting some information, and doing it just like a lot of participants do in a lot of sports, where you just kind of pick it up and learn it as you go. And of course, one of the things that I came across really early, and one of the things that actually drew me to stand-up paddleboarding, was that it wasn't the norm, certainly on flat or open water, to wear a buoyancy aid, like a traditional buoyancy aid or a PFD. And the reasoning behind that, to me, just made complete sense. It made complete sense that if we're not wearing a traditional buoyancy aid, a jacket as such, then as long as we're leashed onto the board and we can swim, I suppose, and get back on our board, that we've got a massive floating bit of equipment that isn't going to sink, that we can get back onto. So for me, I just thought, you know what, that seems to make a lot of sense. Yeah, I don't need to wear one because I can swim and get on my board, and I can also assess the conditions that I'm going to be going out in. And of course, I wouldn't go out in something really hairy because I'm not that experienced yet. But when I started to put some photos up online of me learning to paddleboard and getting out as well, that you would not believe how many people were really upset by the fact that I was out there not wearing a buoyancy aid. and I got thinking about that, because I was like, well, should I or shouldn't I? You know, and I like to think I can make an informed decision, but I could also be wrong. So so I really got thinking about that. I thought, well, what's the norm of the sport, and why do we do that? You know, why do we do that? And it got me thinking. And it got me thinking about, well, what keeps us safe? You know, what keeps us safe? Does the buoyancy aid keep me safe? Does the buoyancy aid mean that I won't drown or I won't be face down in the water? Or does the fact that I'm skilled and experienced in that environment and can make an informed decision keep me safe? So just kind of going back, oh, hang on, can I go back? Just going back to that, what keeps us safe sort of slide just there, I sort of felt like it was a combination of all of those things that was informing my decision that actually not wearing a buoyancy aid on a SUP in the locations I was going to be okay. Now, I wasn't on about white water there, so I probably would wear one in white water because I might not want to be leashed to the board, and also the water's more aerated potentially. But on flat water, and maybe, you know, going for a trip at the sea or on a lake or something like that, I felt like I made a really good decision. Now, when I asked people, you know, to sort of say, well, how come you think I should wear one? Pretty much universally, the answer that people came back to me was, well, you should. I was like, but go on, give me a bit more detail. And they said, well, you should. I said, well, give me some more detail. You know, why should I? Just convince me. And they say, well, you know, what if you fall off your board and you're unconscious? And it's not trying to be a smart answer, but a buoyancy aid is for conscious people. So you can still float face down in a buoyancy aid. So I thought, well, I'll take that, but actually that's only part of an answer. It's not a full one. So, you know, give me a bit more info. And I felt that people typically couldn't give me a really good answer other than it's just what we've always done, so we probably should continue doing it. Now, I'm not here to try and convince you whether you should or shouldn't wear a buoyancy aid on a SUP. You know, that's of course up to you. But it really got me thinking about, is it the kit that keeps us safe? Is wearing a buoyancy aid keeping me safe? Or is it a decision and an understanding the environment that's keeping me safe? And I'd like to think that that's what it is. Anybody got any thoughts on that? I recognise that might be a potentially controversial slide there. You know, any thoughts?
Yeah, I agree with you. Having done kayaking and canoeing, and it's sort of inbred in you to wear a buoyancy aid, it seemed quite foreign to be able to go on a SUP and not wear one. But it really, really does depend on your decision and assessing your environment and knowing the environment that you're going to paddle on, not wait until you get on there. Because like if you're on holiday in Greece and it's a dead flat calm day, you know, shallowish water, sheltered, and you've got your leash on, you know, it's perfectly fine. But you know, in this country, if you decide to go on a lake and it's really windy, or you go on a river where there's some flow, you could quite easily get into trouble. You know, I just think I personally would always wear a buoyancy aid, but I do understand that, you know, if people are skilled enough, it's their decision as to what they do.
Yeah, I really like the way you put that across there, because you said I've got my decision, and it's that you're going to wear one, but you've really rationalized it based upon the information that's in front of you and your own skill level and your own experience as well. The challenge I've had with this is when people just say, I just wear it because that's what we do, and that's the norm, or as people often refer to me and they say, best practice. And I sort of think, well, best practice isn't always a good answer, because it may not be that is actually the best practice, but people say that. So to kind of give you a bit more info here as well, I sometimes wear a buoyancy aid on a SUP, so I do sometimes wear a PFD. So if I'm going out onto maybe a flat calm pond or a lake or something like that, and I think it's really unlikely that I'd end up in any trouble here, then I'll probably not wear one. But I also have a sort of waist belt thing, a manual inflatable waist belt, which means it's really easy to get up and on my board. And if I'm moving around the board a lot, it's not in the way. But it actually gives me something that I can inflate, pulls and it inflates. Should for some strange reason that I actually end up being unattached from my leash, I've still got something there. And of course, there's other times where I think, you know what, I'm going to just put on my normal buoyancy aid and I've got that. But the really important thing for me here is not to just say always or never, not to always do it, or also to never do it, because working in those absolutes is potentially really dangerous. But to make an informed decision and to kind of operate really regularly in the in-between area, I think is really important. So, I knew there's another slide. So that's the waist belt just there. I put this picture on Facebook. This is one of the ones I put on Facebook, and people were really upset by this because they're like, "How is it you can be out there in the water and not be wearing a buoyancy aid?" A lot of people tried to use the thing of, you work for British Canoeing and you're a role model, so you should be role modeling the right thing. And I think I'm actually wearing a buoyancy aid in that picture. Not only that, I'm wearing a wetsuit. If anybody's ever tried to sink in a wetsuit, then you'll realize that is virtually impossible. Just a couple of things that have sort of dropped into the chat there. And Michelle's raised a good point there about you're going to be, people relying upon the fact that SUP will be attached to the board, but you may need to take it off to help others. I agree with you there. If I think I'm going to take my leash off for whatever reason, I think that might be something that happens in that day, then I'd always be wearing something pretty much. In terms of taking it off to help others, we might be getting a bit technical and a bit diverted here, but I would typically not do that even if I was helping other people. But that's just based on the rescue techniques that I would use. Okay, so still thinking about this idea of making informed decisions and people using their equipment to keep them safe. I also have another question here, my other little bugbear that people sort of ask me about. If people are so adamant and in the camp of, I must wear a buoyancy aid on a SUP, why is it that so many people still wear their chest harness incorrectly? Yeah. Even though the information is out there, and even though you can be given the information that it might fail should it come to be released if you don't thread it, if you don't thread it a certain way, but if you don't have it, the tape set up short enough so it releases, why is it that so many people are still setting their chest harness incorrectly? And I'm not certain of the answer of that one, but I do find myself thinking, is that because it's just the way they've always done it? Again, do we come back to the same conclusion of, I do it this way because I've always done it that way? If you're interested, because I realise that might raise some questions, putting that out there, the way to thread the buckle actually does depend on the manufacturer's recommendations, by the way. But it is possible to use the metal plate and go back through the plastic buckle, as long as as long as the tape in the that's exposed from the buckle is short enough so that when you pull it, it releases completely free of the buckle. But it's amazing how many people you'll see wear it to the point of where the tape is so long that actually it would fail if they ever came to use it and release it. So it's worthwhile thinking about what's keeping us safe. Is the decisions and our skills and experience keeping us safe, or is it simply the wearing of kit and equipment? And what's behind your decision? That's one of the things I'm asking people a lot when I'm leading. What's the substance behind your decision? So how come you always wear a buoyancy aid and a SUP? How come you have taken your chest harness off, for example? Why have you decided to do that? How come we're going up the wind now? How come we're going down the wind? If the answers are always or never, I always go up the wind first, or I never use a chest harness, so I take it off, then I think working in those absolutes is potentially quite a dangerous position. So onto a little point here, expect the expected. So this is a little anecdote here, not necessarily linked to leadership, but certainly linked to decisions. And expecting the things that are completely expected, I think, is a really important part of us getting out on the water and maybe in a leadership role. So I went earlier on this year, it would have been back end of January, first week of February, out to the Gambia to train some local young people. I say young people, I think some of the older ones were like early 20s, to be guides on the river. So some of these people in this picture had never been in a kayak before. The vast majority of them could swim, but there was a couple who were really new to swimming as well. And they were being trained in quite an intense sort of 5-day program to pretty much learn to paddle sit-on tops in that environment and to be able to do basic rescues and basic touring and basic guiding in that environment. So they've got no experience of anywhere else other than here. Now, it was absolutely superb experience. It was incredible. It was really, really good. And the guides that were there that we were training absolutely loved the fact that we were doing that with them. And it was literally like we were giving them money, because we were giving them away to gain employment and to be able to go out and to do something. And all of this kit was bought brand new for them, which was incredible. However, one of the things that was said to us quite a lot when we were training these young people was that there's hippos about. You know, in the river, there's hippos. And it was said quite a lot, pretty much most days, whenever we went to a bank that didn't have people on it, because we were paddling up and down the river, whenever we went to a bank that didn't have people there, somebody would always say something about watch out for the hippos. And we never saw one. You know, we never ever saw a hippo. And it's like, well, if what we're expecting to see every single time is a hippo, you know, we never see one, then does that really mean that we should be expecting to see a hippo or not? Now, the information we got here was that hippos typically were at the either end of this island that we were working on. So the island, I think, was about 7 or 8K long, and the hippos were typically living at either end of the island. And so myself and Darren, who's in the bottom of this picture, we went for a paddle on a day off that we had in between. We went for a paddle down to the end of the island just to see what we could see. Yeah. And we found this incredible creek off the side of the river. It was so this isn't the main river. The main river is much wider than this. This is just a little side channel that kind of did a U-bend and rejoined the river. So we're on our way up this little channel, and we're paddling up, and immediately, as we were about a quarter of the way up, I thought, if I was a hippo, this is where I'd hang out. And we're paddling up, and Darren said to me, that grey rock over there looks like a hippo. And as I turned to my left, probably, I'm going to say less than 10 meters away, this hippo just sort of stood up like this, looked at us, and then dived in the water. And I've never paddled so fast, but without making any noise in all my life. We literally just flew up that little creek away from the hippo. We never saw it again. We've got no idea about whether it was under our boats, whether it had turned around and gone back on the land or gone straight across the other side of the river. But we never saw it again. And my heart was literally pounding out of my chest. So, expect the expected. Everybody told us there was going to be hippos. We knew there was hippos there because it's well known that there's hippos on the river. Yeah. And when we went to like where a hippo would hang out, guess what happened? We saw a hippo. So thinking about the idea of expecting the expected, I think is really interesting. The things that are commonplace and the things that typically happen are maybe the things that we could guarantee at some point we're going to see. Of course, we've also got to work out a way of how do we expect the unexpected, which is what I'm going to come to soon. But I just thought that was one of those stories of, if something had happened to one of us, and somebody said, how do we get to that point? I would have said, everybody told us about hippos, and we went to the place where the hippos hang out. So, of course it happened. You know, no real defense for that. We didn't get caught off guard. We pretty much set ourselves up for it. Because we both made it out, it's one of the most amazing experiences I've ever had on the water. But it really could have gone wrong. So coming back to this idea of like leadership and decision making, and I suppose I'm saying things that we've sort of already summarising things we've already talked about here. I'm in that constant process of weighing up the balance of the group, the environment, with my skills and my experience. And when I find things go well, it's typically when the scales there are in balance and we've got a group that are suitably balanced and suitably matched to the environment. I actually think for adventure, in inverted commas, that we probably need the scales to be slightly out of balance a little bit so that the environment is challenging enough that the group are growing and are learning. Yeah. But if the scales are too far out of balance, then that's where we have misadventure essentially. So whenever I'm out on the water, whenever I'm leading, I'm always thinking, does this group match the environment, and do my skills and experience match the group and the environment? As I said before, I quite like stand-up paddleboarding, and I went on a trip to Malta. I think this is about 4 years ago now. So I was fairly new to stand-up paddleboarding. I'd actually done quite a bit. I'd crammed quite a lot into a short space of time. But this was going to be my sort of first time where I really took my skills somewhere and really tried to use them. And what we decided to do was we decided to have a go at circumnavigating Malta. So if you know the geography of Malta, you know that's like a tourist map, and Gozo and Camino are actually up on the top left of the map there. So it doesn't quite look like that for real. But our plan was to start off at Valletta, or just near Valletta, which is at sort of about 2 o'clock on the picture, and to go clockwise around and to go all the way around Camino and Gozo and back round to Valletta as well. So we kind of came to the decision to go to here because somebody had been there on holiday as a kid. You know, if you said like, what was the depth of your decision to go to Malta instead of somewhere else, my answer would be somebody went there on holiday and it was nice. And looking back now, I sort of think, well, that was a good incentive to think about going there, but was it actually a really suitable place to go, matching our skills and our experience with the environment? Because what this person remembered when they said they went there as a kid was hanging out at one of the beaches and it being really nice and crystal blue seas. Now, Malta does have that. Yeah, Malta does have that. But the vast majority of Malta, certainly this bottom sort of left quadrant here, sort of from about 6 o'clock to 9 o'clock at least, is sheer vertical cliffs. So whilst I'm sure many sea kayakers would probably find it not too challenging, I'm sure it could be challenging at times, but not too challenging, doing that sort of distance in a remote location with no way of getting out, once we got there and we realised what we were setting ourselves up for, was going to be really challenging. And also at the very bottom of the picture, if you look, because this is a tourist map as well, so they mark on the tourist things, where it's got the scuba diving mask and snorkel, that basically means you're going to see sharks if you go there. You know, that's what those bits mean. So not only had we made our decision based on just a little bit of an enjoyable holiday that somebody once had, we also were potentially going to exposed cliffs. There was also going to be stuff in the water that we had no idea how we'd handle if it ever came to it. And to top it off, we hadn't really been paddleboarding that much. So looking back now, it's obvious to see that the environment and the group were out of balance. Because the vast majority of Malta actually looked like this. Now, this probably seems really simple. Yeah. And in a kayak, it potentially is, but it was really, really rocky for probably at least 3/4 of the way around. It was really, really rocky. So it was actually very, very difficult to launch and land with even the slightest bit of waves or tide kind of coming up onto the rock shelves there. This looks so straightforward, but this was actually one of our most challenging get-ons because it just took, we were carrying so much kit it took 4 of us to carry the board, one person's board, into the water, leaving less people to carry the other boards, and then somehow the last person trying to get on their own, which created so many challenges. Getting on and off the water was just really, really difficult. It was like a really big headache to start and finish the day. So coming back to our map, we started from Valletta, and it took us the best part of a day to get about maybe 3K down the coast. Yeah. So doing 3K an hour in a sea kayak sounds slow. Doing 3K an hour on a paddleboard sounds slow. Doing 3K in a day, and I'm talking about like a full day, is like really, really slow. Bearing in mind, I think we'd budgeted our time to be like, I think 20 to 25K a day, and we'd have to have one big day in between as well in the amount of time we'd got. So instantly, we knew that our skills and were not matched to the environment, and we were up against some challenges. Second day, we made it round quite a bit further. We got quite a bit more distance there, but still not enough. We made it round to the harbour that's at the bottom right-hand side. So we had some decisions to make then, because we knew that the next part of the journey was going to be committing us to these really sheer cliffs on the left-hand side. And there was a real mix in the group of wanting the adventure, but also wanting to somehow remain safe and within our skill level. Yeah. And to top it all off as well, we were really struggling to stand on our boards with the environment and also the amount of kit we were carrying. It was just really, really hard. So we ended up actually portaging from that harbour there around to pretty much about 10 or 11 o'clock. So actually it's marked on the map if you can see it clearly enough as Golden Bay. We went all the way up there. This man here gave us a lift. We managed to find him just randomly in that harbour, and he gave us a lift up to the top. And having made those decisions, I look back now and I think that was by far the best thing we could have done. Because had we committed to those cliffs, I just don't know what would have happened. It could have been like one of those moments where you see somebody's name on the news and you realise you recognise them. It's not something for the faint-hearted, I think, supping around that bottom coast. Someday I'd like to think I will do it, but that wasn't that day for sure. So we went back around to Golden Bay, and then we ended up realising that going around Go Zone Camino wouldn't be appropriate, so we just carried on back round and managed actually on the top right-hand side of the island to actually find still some sheer cliffs, but some much more paddleable locations. So we started to really be able to speed up a little bit with our trip, which was a real relief, but it was such a learning point where I thought, you know what, we weren't ready for that. Or maybe in some ways we were ready for parts of it, but we would definitely do it differently in terms of how much kit and equipment we were carrying and what we prepared for and what we would do. But again, it got me thinking about, how did we end up here? I'd like to think we made safe decisions along the way, but we really started thinking about, like, how did we actually end up in that position? And somebody's just dropped in the chat there about the difficult decision to say no. I really recognise that it's a real challenge to pull back from a climb or from an ascent or from a section of river that you want to do, but deciding to say no is really challenging. So next question to open out to the floor then. Should a leader only go to places that they know? Because I sort of thought when I went on my Malta trip, I was like, should we have gone somewhere that we knew? Or maybe somewhere that somebody'd sea kayaked before? You know, if somebody could have given us, like, we had people in the group who'd sea kayaked around Anglesey and parts of Scotland. Should we have just kind of repeated one of those trips that we knew it? So it got me thinking about, should a leader only go to places that they know? What do you think? Okay, so no drops into the chat. So a leader can go to places that they don't know. Anybody else got any thoughts? I'm not sure how many people. Oh, go on, Rich. You're in.
Sorry, I was listening from the peripheries, Chris. I think if you have to balance it on the capabilities of a group. So if you're perhaps leading a group of complete novices, then perhaps the decision to go somewhere that's a little bit challenging and unknown may not be the best decision. However, it's in that preparation, that planning, isn't it? You're reading the guidebooks, you're talking to the local knowledge, you're making that decision. If you're going to paddle at a new lake in Scotland or new loch in Scotland that you haven't paddled before, weather conditions, everything else are all lined up, and there's probably little reason perhaps not to go somewhere you haven't paddled before. But if you were taking that same group into a more dynamic, challenging environment, then perhaps that would be the wrong decision if you haven't had it personal experience before. So I think it is perhaps about that planning, that prior preparation, and understanding the limitations or the ability of the group quite well.
Yeah, there's a lot of depth in your answer there, Rich, which is really good, and I think it's something I hear quite a lot when I'm doing leadership courses and leadership assessments, that people say I only really want to lead where I've been before, but that's of course a chicken and egg moment, isn't it? Of how do you get there if you've not been there before, and how do you lead there if you've not led there before as well. But I also think that there's some really informed decision making that needs to go on when you are taking people to, I was going to say to places you don't know, but really there should be decision making going on when you're taking people anywhere, shouldn't they? But maybe there's additional challenges when it's somewhere that's unfamiliar. Now, controversially here, I would say controversially, I think this is an interesting point here. I actually think it can be safer from a leadership position, or I've seen it be safer when people lead in places where they are less familiar. And the reason that I say that is because when people lead in places that are less familiar, they are far more likely to do the research that Rich has just mentioned. They are far more likely to not just assume that it was this way previously and therefore assume it will be the same as it has been before. So of course there's a real comfort with familiarity, isn't there? There's a real comfort with knowing somewhere and saying, well, it's usually like this and I know where to go. But when we don't know somewhere as well, we tend to be a bit more diligent. So we tend to think a little bit more about the trip planning. We think a bit more about the location. We maybe consider the weather a bit more. We consider the group as well. And as Dell's just dropped into the chat there, people do often act a little bit more conservatively when there are places that they, or somewhere that they don't know. So there is potential for that as well, that we might not go to the full extent of our ability or our remit or what our qualifications allow. But I do think people pay a little bit more attention when they're in a location that they don't know and they're leading. Rob's dropped into the chat there goes back to your previous statement about balancing the group and the environment. We probably all have done something with someone we hadn't done before and have adopted a leadership role without knowing it. Yeah, I agree with that as well, actually. Sometimes you just naturally end up dropping into that leadership role, even if that wasn't pre-planned and you're somewhere where you're less familiar. So I want to show you this slide and just give you a little bit of the background here. So this is on a river out in France. This is the Lower Clary. I hope I remember that correctly. I think it is the Lower Clary out in the French Alps. And it's a river that I've done before I took this photo, before the situation I'm about to talk about. It's a river that I've done probably once before. Yeah. And I first went out to the Alps in 2005, and that was when I did it for the first time, and then 2019 was the second time. Yeah. So for all intents and purposes, it's virtually an unfamiliar river. Yeah, I couldn't remember the twists and turns or the location properly. Now, this is one of those moments where I'm going to sort of say, it went a bit wrong here. So leading up to this point and me standing on the bank and taking this photo, the group had told me that their favourite river, I was leading a group, the group had told me that their favourite river was the Lower Clary. And in my mind, when they said it's the Lower Clary, I thought, oh, I've not done that for quite some time. And I think I've only done it the once. As you're going through in your mind thinking, how many times have I done that? Probably only the once. And I thought, what's my memory of it? And my memory of it was that it wasn't that good, there was loads of trees, and I just really didn't enjoy it. And so I think that had impacted my decision making to take groups there or to not take groups there over the years, when I've always just sort of swerved that river and been like, you won't enjoy it, let's go somewhere that's probably a bit better. Yeah. Either way, the group, I don't want to say convinced me, but the group made a really strong case for saying that this was a river that they wanted to do. And I thought, you know what, I can lead in an unfamiliar environment, so I'm fine with that. Yeah, I'm okay with that. Did a bit of research, checked out with some people that had been down there recently. Is there any trees? Is there any problems? And so on. And so we get on the river, and we're coming down the river, and it's probably about 2 or 3K into this stretch. I think we had about 7 or 8K to do. And pretty much from the start, I just went, this is amazing. Why have I not done this river? It's really, really good. I'm absolutely loving this. And I just thought, there's no reason I shouldn't have been bringing groups here for all this time, because it is really, really good. And the vast majority of the river is like these sort of shingle beds that sort of change direction a little bit as it gets more and more water. And over the years, they will slowly change the direction in the actual river as well. And we came around the corner, and I spotted this tree, and just out of shot as well, you might be able to see it a little bit, there was another tree blocking the second channel as well. So there was 2 channels, one bigger, one smaller, but 2 trees pretty much down blocking both the channels. And instantly it was like, this is that moment where all of those skills that you've got need to come into play. So I was at the front because I really hadn't paddled it before, or not recently, and I was trying to sort of see around the bends a little bit. I saw this and I thought, right, we need to get out of the way of this. So what I wanted everybody to do was to come round into the middle and to try and land on the beach, which was very doable. If they knew that was going to be the plan beforehand, they would have been able to do that no problem. But as they came around to the beach, the first person in front of me, first person behind me, didn't quite make the eddy. So that meant that everybody else behind them thought that was the eddy they were trying to get, even though I'm frantically waving and telling people where to go. So what that meant then is that pretty much the rest of the group then started to get washed towards this tree. And it's the kind of water there that's like, it's inevitable. It doesn't matter how good you can paddle. Eventually you're going to land on that obstacle. So I jump out my boat to cut a short story a little bit shorter, jump out my boat, run round, and there's people on the tree, in boats and out of boats, who are basically in a what could be life-threatening strainer type situation. One person managed to get fished off from the other side, and I managed to pull like I think it was 3 people off from this near side when they tried to avoid the tree, because it was actually really quite shallow water, which in some ways makes the strainer even more dangerous, but it did mean I could access them relatively safely. I'd say safely very loosely there, but to the point of where I thought, I'm going to do something to help save somebody's life here. So again, that got me thinking, and sorry, the outcome of that, by the way, is that everybody was fine in the end. You know, apart from a few little bumps and bruises and people going, that was close, everything was okay. But it got me thinking again about that idea of leading in that unfamiliar environment. You know, what extra precautions do we take? Do we take extra precautions? Do we not? Do we let our guard down more when we're in a familiar environment? You know, how does this all fit together? This is one of those moments where I think, looking back, it could have been different. And it could have been different in the way that I think we just might have avoided this completely. Yeah. But the benefit of hindsight is always really, really clear, isn't it? And it could have, of course, been different in that people could have really had a very terrible time on there. And in the end, it was only for a brief moment that it wasn't very pleasant. So, bottom line is, if you don't know, avoid strainers like that. you don't want that on the river. You certainly don't want to be heading towards one of those in or out of your boat. So I spoke to a friend of mine after this this moment there, and I sort of was a bit like, quite reflective really, and I thought, how did we get there and what happened, and could I have avoided that? Could I not have avoided that? Was it inevitable? And a friend of mine, Paul Smith, who's actually written a book that's about to come out now, called Adventure Sports Coaching, which I think is going to be really, really good, to be perfectly honest. So it's worthwhile seeking that out. It should be out by Christmas or maybe just after. And he came up with a quote that he'd written for a lecture himself, saying, in order for sound instinctive decision making in a dynamic environment or activity to occur, an adventure sports coach needs to be exposed to a wide range of experience, both positive and negative, as well as developing sound reflective practice. And that was actually really comforting to read that, because I sort of thought, well, I'm at least on my way then. You know, I'm trying to make this, I'm trying to work on my decision making in a dynamic environment, and I am exposing myself to positive experiences, and I'd also recently had that negative experience, and I'm working through like what I think is good reflective practice, thinking about it in context with my peers, and being open about that situation happening and wanting to avoid it in the long run again. So that was really useful for him to give me. Oh, I don't know how I've done that. Sorry. That was really useful for him to give me that as a bit of information. But it also really helped to frame it up quite well. You know, you sort of think, at the moment, I've not really got a mission statement. I've not really got anything that I'm working towards other than trying to be a better leader. So that little mission statement was really useful. So thinking about recognizing these signs, that's one of the things that I think is really important. You know, if we're thinking about avoiding a problem, it's really rare that an issue in the outdoors just appears out of nowhere. It's really rare for it just to be going from 0 to 100 and something completely unknown happens without any kind of prior warning. You could even argue that tree being in the river could have had some prior warning, in that maybe we could have been more observant with the nature of the land. Maybe we could have done more research. Maybe it could have been obvious as there was other trees at the side of the river, but in the river earlier on. So we could have possibly spotted that. But thinking about how do we recognize those signs, I think, is essential. So this actually this predates the story I just told, but I just want to give you a little bit of background to me researching what I'm going to show you next. So this is Chateau Kiras Gorge out in the south of France, which some of you may or may not know. It's like, that's about a third of this stretch of river. It's really quite narrow. There's some parts where you can't actually turn your boat sideways. Certainly not a typical modern 8 or 9 foot kayak can't turn sideways. And it's probably about grade 4 for the vast majority of it. This is actually a slightly easier moment in the gorge. But it's very manageable. You know, it's one of those things that actually, for a lot of people who apply themselves to whitewater paddling, you could almost certainly aspire to get to this point. You know, when you start off, you went, I'm really up for this and I really want to be a whitewater boater. It's well within a lot of people's capabilities. And it's got a bit of a reputation because it's so unique. And the guidebook adds to that reputation. So it sort of lures you in a little bit, talking about the gorge being a test piece and a rite of passage. And also that the warning that it looks horrible from above and it's difficult to judge scale. And for me, that's one of those things that not only grabs my attention as a whitewater boater, but I know for a fact it grabs my students' attention and grabs people that I'm leading, grabs their attention as well, because it's so recognizable as a section of water. So we went into it with a group, and it's not uncommon for people to roll in there. So it's not unusual if you know it or don't know it, but it's not great if there's multiple people rolling. You know, if there's multiple people having a nightmare at the same time, you kind of want it to be just one person, not everybody. And of course, then in this moment, people started swimming. And again, I was thinking about what's the timeline of how we got to this point. You know, I'm not taking the photos, by the way. I'm actually in the water, not in the water, but on the water at this point. But it got me thinking about what's the timeline to get to this point again. You know, we've got people who say they're up for this. We've got people who are skilled enough to do this. But when we get in the water and we go for it, it seems like all of that goes out the window again. You know, what's the kind of human element here? Because the skills are fine, the environment's fine, it feels like we're appropriately balancing and matching the group fine, but there's something that is still going wrong here. So the kind of brief notes that I wrote down after this was that it was the end of the trip, so they were not going to have any other opportunities to paddle this. This was pretty much their last chance at that, and they've been building up to it. And the rest of the group was actually filming it, so there was a lot of external pressure because there was only 4 people who were going to do it, and the rest of the group was just stood on the bank and stood on the bridges watching it as well. And the group, or some of the members of the group, had actually had very little sleep and were a bit hungover, so they certainly weren't at the peak of their physical ability at that point. Yeah. And Simon's just dropped in there about heuristic traps. Yeah, absolutely. This is the heuristic traps that we're going into just here. So bringing back those scales again, it was obvious that the group and the environment were mismatched. You know, even with the best intentions, it just wasn't right. It just wasn't right. As Simon said again, the lemons were stacking up and just something wasn't working. And that snowball effect was happening. So as I mentioned at the start, it wasn't just one cataclysmic moment where something occurred and it just all blew up and went wrong. It was actually a little thing happening over and over again, a little snowball effect, or the lemons lining up, as Simon said. I'm sure we understand the lemon analogy with the lemons on the fruit machine. You know, if you get 3 lemons, then you're out. So 1 lemon is not too bad. 2 lemons isn't great, but 3 lemons, it's game over. Yeah, so looking out for those lemons and looking out for things snowballing. So it could be even just somebody saying that you know, they've forgot the spray deck and that we need to now do the shuttle again. You know, it takes an extra 20 minutes. Or maybe somebody hasn't eaten for lunch, you know, or they're not feeling that well, or they're a bit hungover. I'm not saying about being superstitious here. It's not about like, oh, if you haven't put your left shoe on first, and you always put your right one on, then you shouldn't do it. It's more about spotting these human signs that we're not quite ready for this. And one of the problems that I really came to, which is these heuristic traps that I'm going to, is people try and take shortcuts. So that we can navigate normal life, everyday life, we have, in a way, we have shortcut processes that we use so that we don't have to work everything out for the first time. Yeah. So my guess is that when you go into your bathroom, you'll go into your bathroom, when you want to brush your teeth, you just pick the toothbrush up. You'll do it in the same hand you always do. You'll flip the toothpaste open with the same thumb you always use. You'll put it on and you'll brush your teeth the normal way, whatever the normal way is for you. And my guess is it will take like 0.1% of your thinking power to do that. Yeah. And that's essentially because you've come up with that program, that heuristic, that shortcut, so that you can just brush your teeth without giving it too much thought. And you'll have loads of processes like that. So you'll have the same sort of thing for making a cup of tea. You'll have the same sort of thing for tying your shoelaces, because you don't have to work it out every time. It would take too much energy and too much mental capacity to work out something brand new every single time. The thing that makes it different to paddling white water, or any kind of water really, is that the environment when you're doing that is going to be fixed. So when you're brushing your teeth, the floor isn't on fire, it's not windy in there, and there's not somebody throwing rocks at you. I mean, well, I guess that's not the case, yeah? But there's no additional complications to brushing your teeth. It's basically the same as it always is. The challenge is when we as humans apply these shortcut thinking processes to a dynamic environment, that we end up in a place where the shortcut doesn't quite work. So I'm going to go through the shortcuts, and I would have thought that you'll recognize some of these either in your own paddling and your own practice, or maybe you've seen them happen to other people as well. And this research that I'm going to just summarize here, I really only am summarizing it here, comes from this chap, Ian McCammon. So what he did was he basically looked at a load of skiing and mountaineering incident reports and did more research into that, and basically thought, well, if we've got real good skills, we've got real good equipment, and we've got real good ways of predicting the weather, why is it that people that are good at their sport still go out and have real problems and still end up in trouble? And I love the way that he's put this. Even though people are capable of making decisions in a thorough and methodical way, it appears that most of the time they don't. A growing body of research suggests that people unconsciously use simple rules of thumb or heuristics to navigate the routine complexities of modern life. Yeah. So those heuristics are fine for brushing your teeth, but they're not really okay when you come to paddle a rapid or come to make a decision whether to go on the water or not, or even as simple as, do I or do I not wear a buoyancy aid on my sup? So familiarity is one of the heuristic traps. Now, for those of you that recognise this, or don't recognise this, I should say, this is on the River Dee. This is Serpent's Tail. This is what I'd think of as being like one of my home runs. You know, I know this river really, really well. Yeah. I've paddled it a lot in kayak. I've paddled it less in canoe, but I have paddled it a lot in canoe as well. And what's interesting is that sometimes I can still swim here. You know, this is me in the water. This is me swimming. And sometimes I can still swim in this location. And it's really easy in the locations that we go to be so familiar with them that we assume they'll be the same again next time. One of the specific reasons that this photo is actually really important to explain this bit is there was a period for about 12 months where this drop changed. Yeah. Nobody can really put their finger on exactly why it changed, but it went from being a sort of flowing wave at the end to all of a sudden being what you can see here, quite a narrow, powerful ledge hole with a lot of recirculation there. And so what was happening is that people were coming to the Dee, and because it's just the Dee and they've done it a million times before, they were getting on Serpent's Tail, they weren't checking it out, and all sorts of competent paddlers were having an absolute nightmare at the bottom of this rapid because they were so familiar with it that they thought it's going to be the same as last time. And for a period of about, I think it's about 12, 18 months, it just wasn't the same. It's changed a bit again now, and it's a little bit easier than it certainly is in this picture. But it's really interesting that the places that we go to really regularly could be one of the places that we are most likely to use one of those heuristics and maybe make a shortcut for our decision making when actually we could potentially do with thinking about it a little bit more. That familiarity as well goes back to that idea of, are we safer or do we make more informed decisions in unfamiliar environments? So there's a direct link to what I was saying before there. If this was somewhere unfamiliar, maybe more people would be inclined to get out and have a look at it to check it out. But because it's familiar, people just go straight through. So consistency is one of the other heuristic traps, according to Ian McCammon. And the idea of consistency is not just consistency with like a plan or an idea, but consistency with self-image as well. So if you're a grade 3 paddler and you're presented with a grade 3 rapid, well, it would be consistent to your self-image and to what you would normally do if you were to paddle it, even if that wasn't necessarily the right decision. Now, this rapid, if you may or may not be able to recognize it, this is a rapid called Hypoxia, which is out in Uganda. And it's one of the most incredible rapids I've ever seen. It's just all of the water in the world seemingly going down this sort of U-bend almost, and then down into a really enormous ledge hole. And this is a chap called Max Bilbo up at the top right, who was one of the first people to paddle it for a very long time. It had been paddled before he went down there, but not for, I think, over 10 years. The first person to paddle this, I'm under the understanding, actually went down it because they thought it was the wrong channel. They thought there was a different channel on the river. Yeah. So they actually went down it by accident because they basically told somebody they were going to do it and then picked the wrong channel. So thinking about that consistency of image and consistency of the plan. If you said you're going to do something and then you turn up and like it seems like it's the wrong decision, it's amazing how many people will still go with that decision. So even people who turn up for their club weekend at the River Dee, for example, they turn up there and the river's really high, you'd be amazed how many people still got on the same section of river because that was their plan. So thinking about avoiding sticking to the plan if the plan isn't the right thing. Now, acceptance is a really interesting one, and this is where like our human nature is put on show a little bit here. In that, if we'll make more friends, yeah, and if people will like us, and if other people are doing things, then there's a real good chance that we will also take risk that we wouldn't normally take, or do things that we wouldn't normally do, because other people are doing them. And I certainly think of the times when I've been on the water or doing other things as well, and people have sort of egged me on a little bit, and I think, actually, you know, if they're all doing it, maybe I should as well. So that idea of being accepted in the group is actually one of the heuristic traps. When McCammon looked at his research, he found it was actually pretty common for people to do something or to take an unnecessary risk and then end up in trouble because of it, because they were there with their friends, essentially. Now, interestingly, I actually found that mixed gender groups statistically are more likely to take more risks than single gender groups. Yeah. So a mixed gender group is potentially, I don't want to say it's dangerous, but it's potentially a place where there is more risk than in single gender groups, which is really interesting. Social facilitation is one that I think is really prevalent of these heuristic traps at the moment. Essentially, if you're being filmed, or you're filming yourself, as is quite common now, and you're going to be able to put that on social media, and you're going to get likes from it, and people are going to make comments, and all of that sort of thing, then it's actually more likely that will that you'll take an unnecessary risk, or a risk you wouldn't do if you weren't filming yourself and publishing your own media from that. And I actually go paddling with a friend of mine. He says this a little bit tongue-in-cheek, but I do know there's some truth to it. He says, I really only go canoeing for the pictures. And it's interesting that I'm sure he does do things out on the water, and he's talking about whitewater canoeing when he says that. I'm sure he does do things that he genuinely does because there's somebody filming him, or he's able to film himself. This one I think is a really interesting one, and will, I'm sure, resonate very well with some people as well. Scarcity of resource. So if there's a limited options or limited opportunities, then we are more likely to take a risk, even if it's not the right thing to do. Yeah. So if you don't recognize that, this is Mount Kilimanjaro, and as I'm sure many of us know, there's a lot of people who will have never mountaineered before, and will do a charity walk or whatever, and will go up Mount Kilimanjaro essentially as their first like bigger mountain. And they'll of course pile loads of money and loads of time into going there, and what they've probably got is a 1 or 2 day window to do it. And this could be that once in a lifetime opportunity to do this. And so what they'll do is they'll take a risk, or they'll make their decision at least, based on the fact that they're probably not going to come back. Now, if they had the benefit of being able to go up the mountain at any time of the year, if that was possible, then that would affect their decision making differently. So they would start to think about, well, actually, is this the right time? Do I feel right? Is the group right? Is the environment right? Is the weather right? They would take all of that into account a little bit more. Now, I'm not saying that people take unnecessary risk on Mount Kilimanjaro. It's just a really good example of like a once in a lifetime moment. But you'll also get people who will travel from London. You know, they're based in the centre of London. They live in a high-rise flat, but they're like a really extreme whitewater paddler, and they'll drive like 11 hours, whatever it is, to get to Scotland to go and paddle a rapid or a specific river, or go for a camp or whatever it might be. And then they'll get up there and the weather won't be right, or the river will be too high, or so on. And potentially they'll just go, let's just do it anyway, because it's taken me 11 hours to get here. So the final trap here which I think is really interesting. I say really interesting about all of them actually, I think. But this is specific to me actually, because the expert halo, or the idea of leading somebody or looking after somebody or being seen as an expert, is something that essentially I make my career on, certainly in paddle sport anyway. So McCammon's definition of the expert halo is that people will take more risk if they're in the presence of an expert, or at least somebody they perceive to be an expert. And the interesting thing that he follows up with that is that he says that often that placement of expertise from the participant to somebody else is misjudged or ill-informed. So the reason I've picked this picture, I know it's not a paddling one, but the reason I picked this picture is I think this guy knows what he's doing. You know, he looks like he knows what he's doing. He's got his rope, he's got his chalk, he looks like he's been climbing, you know, he's toned, he's got tattoos. I mean, he's got a great beard as well, hasn't he? You know, if there was a beard for rock climbing, he's got it. But this guy, I believe, is just a model. You know, he's literally just a really pretty face for advertising rock climbing. So if you met him down at the climbing wall or the equivalent out on the water, it'd be really easy to assume, oh, you know what you're doing. Want to go paddling? Want to hold my ropes? You know, do you mind if I come with you? And actually, you could really misplace that level of expertise based on their charisma or their equipment or what they say that they've done or been doing. So the idea that people take more risk in the presence of an expert is actually a really scary one for me. I sort of think maybe I've become like a risk magnet when I say, you know, come paddling with me, because people will take more risk. So I'm nearly there. I'm aware that like time's ticked on. I can chat about this all day, can't I? But can we avoid these heuristic traps? And yes, we can. Okay, yes, we can. Doing some of the things that we've already mentioned. Now, I hope people get the Spider-Man reference here. This is just sort of showing a little bit about what I'm into. So Spider-Man has this this little phrase: "With great power comes great responsibility," and we can avoid one of the heuristic traps by taking some responsibility. Yeah. And it shouldn't just be the leader's responsibility to take responsibility. Yeah. So actually we should be thinking about, or if we are in a leadership position, empowering the people that we're working with to actually try and take some responsibility, some ownership of what's going on. So thinking about, can they impact the decisions? Can we give them some kind of ownership of what's going on? Can we let them know what's happening? Can we ask them what they think should be happening? Because otherwise it just ends up being one person's responsibility. If anybody's ever done any leading with Duke of Edinburgh award, then you'll know that what typically happens in a Duke of Edinburgh group is that you've got 6 people with enormous rucksacks and their pans hanging off the back, going for a walk, and what you've got is you've got one person reading the map. Yeah, seeing some nodding heads there, so that sounds familiar. You've got one person reading the map. So when they get lost, whose fault is it? It's that one person who said, I'll read the map. Yeah. Now, if you had everybody attempting to read the map, then you might still get lost, but at least there's some ownership and at least there's some responsibility shared there. So empowering the people that we're leading, or the people that we are leading with, should I say, to take some responsibility, I think is a really important part of avoiding the traps in the first place. Oh. A culture of question and reflection, I think, is really important as well. So questioning the leader and questioning the decisions, and it's not questioning from a negative point of view, but it's just making sure that you have the information and that the leader hasn't missed something that might be obvious, and that you're just checking that what we're doing is the right thing. And I totally recognize that within different groups and different dynamics, that can be really, really difficult for a participant to do. Yeah, especially if the dynamic of the leader and the person being led has been set up of, I'm the leader and you do what I say. which I don't think is a great way to lead personally. But if that's the way it's been set up, then it can be really difficult for that person to then ask a question or to point something out that they think's wrong. If you've set it up whereby you're leading with people or you're working with people, you might still be the nominated leader, but you're encouraging interaction, you're encouraging people to talk back to you and to give you some information and to help you with decision making and to question things as well, then we're actually really likely to, or more likely to, avoid some of those heuristic traps. As a little side example here, that there's planes that have literally fallen out of the sky because they ran out of fuel and people knew about it. You know, there's people who had spotted that they were going to run out of fuel but didn't want to tell the pilot. Yeah, and that's a really interesting thing, isn't it? That if you spot something, but you think that something isn't quite right, but you think, well, I'll not tell them because they know what they're doing, then it just might be that person had missed that. A really simple one that I use on quite a lot of my courses is my buoyancy aid has got a pocket, as I think most buoyancy aids do, and I really like that to be closed if I've got stuff in it, yeah, because the stuff that's in it is important, and it might be my car keys and it might be my phone. So if you spot me with my buoyancy aid open, then don't say, "Oh, Chris is an expert, therefore he must have his buoyancy aid open for a reason," because why would he leave it like that? So if you spot that something like that is happening, even if it's a small thing, you might just want to say, "Do you know you've got that unzipped? Or is that meant to be the case?" Or if it's a bigger decision, you might just want to say something like, "Yeah, can I just check we're doing the right thing here? Because there's the weather, there's the river, there's this person who's cold, there's all these different things that I just want to check you've spotted." I do recognize that can be really difficult to put into leadership, but I actually think that encouraging students to check in, to question, to make sure that you are doing the right thing if you're leading is really important. And reflecting, as I mentioned all the way through, learning from those experiences and thinking back about them is essential. Communication, I think this goes without saying, but actually talking about the plan, discussing the plan, people knowing what's going on is really, really essential. So people often talk about doing river signals or maybe doing a briefing beforehand. And, you know, all of those sort of things are really, really good. As long as people understand how we're going to talk and how we're going to interact, and actually talking, questioning and checking and challenging, I think is essential. And as we mentioned from the start, doing some effective planning. Yeah, actually thinking about what's the best plan, what's plan A, you know, what's our first plan, what's the thing we've come here to do, but what's plan B? You know, if we turn up and the wind's blowing the wrong way, what's plan B? If plan B doesn't work, you know, what's plan C? And plan C might not be the one you want to do, you know, it might not be the one that's actually you're up for, but it might just be that it's the one that you actually, you know, will do if there's no other options. And also having a plan to say no, as somebody mentioned before as well, and just say, well, let's not do this, I think is really essential. So I realised I've kind of chatted for about an hour and a half there. I hope some of that is useful, and that people have got something out of that. Simon, you've sent me a message in the chat. Can you share that that facets model in the chat? Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, send that through. That's great. And I'm kind of just here now if anybody's got any thoughts or anybody's got anything they want to chat about, any reflections on what I've said, personal experiences, or of course if you're you know, if you're like, it's 9 o'clock and I'm ready for bed, or maybe is Bake Off on tonight? Or is Bake Off? Is it Bake Off? Is it, or is it MasterChef? One of them's on tonight, I think. Then by all means you can head off to do that if that's what you want to do.
Thanks, Chris. That's absolutely brilliant. Been really interesting. I've thoroughly enjoyed listening to that, and really made us think. Your questions about our role within the group when we're paddling, not necessarily just we're leading the group, but just within the group. So If anyone's got any question, oh, there you go. Bake Off has ended.
Oh, no, that shows after I watch Baker. Oh, I'm getting it confused with I'm a Celebrity. Yeah.
I think that one's finished as well.
That one's finished as well. Yeah, I know that's ended. Yeah.
So no, but no, that's absolutely brilliant. And I think you mentioned Paul Smith, has written the book, the coaching.
You know what? I'm gonna have to check what the title is now, but I think it's Adventure Sports Coaching.
Right. Because I know we've got Dan Wilkinson.
Yes, so he's written it with Dan. Yeah, so whichever book Dan's talking about, that's the right one.
Yeah, so we've got Dan Wilkinson talking coaching adventure sports. That's on the 4th of February. So
yeah, that'll be really good. By the way, you know, if you come to a few of these, Dan is a great speaker. Is super intelligent and really funny as well. So yeah, I'm going to go to that one.
Brilliant, thank you. So anyone got any questions? If you want to wave at us or anything you want to add. Okay.
I have a question for you, Chris. You were talking about leaderships. Do you have a specific resource where you have that information? Are there specific books or websites you're looking at? What gives you more information and background to share with others?
So the research that I mentioned about the heuristic traps, if you put in Ian McCammon, I'm going to write that into the chat, and then you've got that. If you put in Ian McCammon, heuristic, can't spell it now, heuristic traps, and I think it's 2002, but there's also research from 2004. If you put that into Google, that will bring up the document that I'm referencing there as well for the heuristic traps. Some of the I think Simon's just dropped that into the chat as well. Thank you. And some of the other things I've summarized in my book as well. Is the book isn't just there to, I'm not here to promote that, but I have summarized it in that as well. And you can download the PDF for free. So if you just want a PDF of it, if you would read it on your computer, just get on there on my website and you can literally download it for free. I really don't mind. I'd rather people read the information and that helped than people like not be able to read it because of a barrier for payment.
I think
so by all means do that.
I think I downloaded, but no clue where.
Yeah, I think you have as well. I do spot whose names come up there, so I think you've got it already.
Excellent, thank you. Has anyone else got anything? I think the question of leadership is really interesting because it's not just, I think, who you're with. Because those of you that know Dave, he's an okay paddler, I suppose. You know, he's okay. He knows what he's doing. And then I come along, who has hardly put a paddle in the water ever, and I'm learning. And yet, because I'm with Dave, people assume I have a much better paddling ability than I do. And they ask me all these complicated technical questions, and I have absolutely no idea what the answer is. And it's just like, oh, Dave. But it is, you know, it's that misplaced idea of leadership and what people have got to offer. So it's making sure you know who your leader is as well, I think.
Yeah, and I don't try and make it out to be easy, by the way. You know, I'm not saying it's easy. I'm not saying it's all the answers. And without a doubt, at some point in the future, I'll probably get it wrong again sometimes. But thinking about it and actively doing something about it to develop your leadership, or even just develop being a good member of a group, an effective group member, I think is just as important.
This was a With Dave production.